In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Karl Popper, who lived from 1902 to 1994. Let me explain briefly what the structure of the lecture will be. First, I'm going to go through a few preliminaries about his life and so on. Second, I'm going to talk about scientific knowledge and the challenge that Popper offered to traditional views of scientific knowledge. I'm then going to talk about what the resulting picture is of scientific knowledge as it comes out of Popper's work. I'm then going to talk about what I'll call the big picture, about what this view really means for us, his picture of human beings and of what we're up to. From this, I'll turn to his ideas about society, and then to a brief conclusion. First, then, some preliminaries. I must, at the outset, confess to a special interest in Popper. I was a student of his at the London School of Economics, that's part of the University of London, and I actually worked as his personal assistant for over 8 years, so I've got a special stake in this. Popper has a major reputation in the United Kingdom. He has quite wide recognition on the European continent, but I think he's less well known in the US, although I think he deserves to be better known here. Who was he? Well, he was born in Austria of non-observant Jewish parents. They had, in fact, formally converted to Lutheranism, but were really sort of secular in their outlook. Popper, though, because he was of Jewish ancestry, had to flee, anticipating that there would be a takeover in Austria of a Nazi regime. He got, during the Second World War, a job as a philosophy lecturer in New Zealand, and then at the end of the Second World War, he moved to the UK, where he taught at the University of London. During the course of his life, he made some visits to and held some brief appointments in the US, but he was largely centred in the UK. His chief works, the works for which he's best known, are The Logic of Scientific Discovery, initially published in Vienna as Logik der Forschung, and also The Open Society and Its Enemies. He published a whole bunch of other books as well. Why does Popper matter? Well, his views have important implications, both for how we understand knowledge, how we view ourselves, but also for society. Let me commence the substance of the lecture by saying something about scientific knowledge and the challenge that Popper made to establish ideas in this area. There are two aspects of the traditional view of knowledge that he called into question. On the one side, people often have talked about knowledge as being justified, true belief. It's belief, things that people believe. If it's knowledge, it's true, but also it must be justified. It's not things that are true but people happen to know by accident. It's rather things which people, in a sense, can prove or demonstrate are correct. The second aspect of things to do with knowledge that Popper challenged were that claims to knowledge are often seen as a justification for the authority of rulers. An image here, going right back in time, is to Plato's Republic and to the notion there of philosopher kings, the notion that if some people really know the truth about the world and about human nature, they should have political authority. There's a sense in which this is echoed through time, this notion that the expert should be in charge. And these are things that Popper challenged. Popper argued, with respect to knowledge, that we should learn an important lesson from the challenge that Einstein made to Sir Isaac Newton. In order to understand this and its significance, one has first of all to appreciate something of the significance of Newton's scientific ideas. One had with Isaac Newton human knowledge of a kind which one had never had up to that point. You had in his Principia a unified theory about the ordinary happenings in the physical world, with also a theory which dealt with the motions of the planets. That this was not only something which scientists got excited about, but ordinary people as well, because one could do things like being able to predict the return of comets in detail, in a way which one could never do before. He made a huge impact on people of his day, even on poets. Alexander Pope, the poet, is well known for the epitaph that he wrote for Newton. nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. So one's got here a really impressive example of human knowledge that seemed, in a sense, to show that mankind could have a knowledge of the world of a sort that people had perhaps hoped for before but had never really got. Here one seemed to have it. And it's in this context that Popper wanted to argue that one should appreciate the significance of Einstein's challenge to Newton. That's to say, what Einstein did was to take the best and best confirmed piece of human knowledge that we had ever had and to argue that it was not quite right, that it was wrong, and to put forward an alternative to it. And Popper argued that this really illustrates something important, namely that while in science we can aim at truth, we can never tell for sure that we have reached it. So even the kind of well-confirmed scientific knowledge that got poets excited might turn out not to be right. Our best-known knowledge, science, Popper wanted to say, isn't justified true belief. He wanted to say that scientific knowledge, as in the case of Newton, may turn out not to be true. It certainly is something which isn't justified because however many times and however impressively it's confirmed, this may not show that it's true. It may be false. And Popper wanted to say it's best not to look at scientific knowledge as belief, as something you carry around in your heads. Rather, what Popper wanted to say is think of scientific knowledge as being something which is better seen as the abstract content of statements and our theories, as having a content to it that no one may have fully grasped and understood. Popper also further argued that experts are fallible and should be open to criticism, that knowledge doesn't justify unquestioned political authority. Altogether, the result of this is that Popper offers us a middle path between, on the one side, the uncritical adulation of science, and on the other, people who are relativists, people who give no special status to science. Popper thought that science was wonderful. He thought that it was a human achievement of the highest possible order and cultural significance, but what he wanted to stress was its fallibility. How, though, does all this work? How are we to make sense of it? Well, what Popper wanted to argue is that all of our knowledge is fallible. You could never tell what might need correction. He wanted to say, on the other hand, that we can aspire to truth and that we can aspire to knowledge which is better than what we've got up to this point. How are we to do this? Well, basically, we need, in Popper's perspective, to start from where we are. There are no certain foundations of knowledge on which we can build. Rather, start from where we are, try to discover problems with our knowledge, and then try to discover something which will give us an advance on what we've had previously, a movement towards the truth. What does this amount to in terms of a wider picture of scientific knowledge? Let me say something about that. Isaac Newton, when giving an account of his views, gave an account of scientific knowledge as being simply derived from experience, as being built on induction, as being built on careful observation, careful generalization, and so on. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, had argued that there is a problem about induction, namely that it's unreliable. This is best illustrated by an example which Bertrand Russell gave, which I will Americanize for the current occasion. Take a turkey. Someone may have it in their yard, in a little hut. Every morning the turkey sticks its head out of the hole and gets grain. It gets fed. It goes on, sticks its head out, fed. Sticks its head out, fed. Okay? Builds up a habit, a disposition, expectations, until Thanksgiving morning, sticks its head out. Okay. And essentially this was Hume's point. Namely, that we can't be sure that these regularities will continue. And indeed, he went on to argue that any attempt to justify these things, say by saying it's worked okay in the past, will turn out to be circular. So there are big problems about this. And what Popper says is, look, it isn't a real problem for us that induction isn't reliable in this way, because science doesn't work by induction. Science works by what Popper called conjectures and refutations, by our anticipating what things are like in a way that isn't justified and then learning where we've got things wrong. Secondly, Popper said, look, if you take this view, then the production of science, the making of discoveries, isn't a matter just of observing carefully and so on. Rather, it can involve inspiration. And there's a sense in which Popper's account of science at its best can make the scientist as being something like the novelist, the musician, or the artist, someone who may have a real vision which they pursue and bring inspiration to our understanding of the world. But clearly it's important, if people are operating in this way, and if what you're after is knowledge which will tell us what the world is actually like, that these ideas be put to the test. Ideally, I suppose, people will do this for themselves, but Popper stressed very strongly the way in which, if you don't do this yourself, other people will do it for you. If you make some claim about what things are like, then other people will check it out. And indeed, just because other people are going to check it out, then each individual is likely to run through the obvious checks and so on, check up on their experimental work, put it through the most rigorous criticism that they can think of before exposing it to the criticism that other people are offering. But the picture that Popper offers is of objectivity as being a product of critical interaction with other people. He sees objectivity as being not the product of someone who is particularly disciplined, who keeps their imagination in check and so on. Rather, he says, no, a scientist, and indeed anyone, can be imaginative, but they attain objectivity as a result of the exposure of their ideas to criticism, so that we may always have something to learn from other people. He offers, in a sense, a social account of the achievement of objectivity. Someone may, on hearing all of this, say, well, look, this is all very well, but what about ideas that aren't testable? And what, someone might say to Popper, what about your own philosophical views? They don't seem to be testable. Does that mean they're no good? One might respond on Popper's behalf, I think, in the following way. To say, first of all, look, testability is certainly a virtue. That if you have some idea, it's that much better an idea if you can suggest how it can be tested out. But also, ideas that can't be directly tested may be important. They can serve as what Popper at one point called metaphysical research programs. By metaphysical, he here meant not directly testable, but he said these may offer us a picture of what explanations look like, they may serve to inspire us, but what he said about these things is that they may guide and inspire scientific work, but they may not themselves be testable scientific theories. It's important, though, he said, to make sure that they are open to criticism, that they're open to a weaker form of intersubjective assessment, namely, you claim that they can solve certain kinds of problems and then allow other people to assess them against that. And the same, I think, would be his view of the status of his own philosophy, that it isn't science, it isn't testable, but it can certainly be put forward and be criticized, and indeed it has been criticized by various other philosophers. What does all this mean for us? What, in a sense, is the big picture that's generated from Popper's work? Well, first of all, Popper wants to stress that human beings have got biological and social predispositions, that we interpret the world through theoretical categories, that we bring ways of understanding things to the world, that we're not, as it were, a blank slate on which the world just writes its impressions, rather we're actively trying to see things, but we've got biases and prejudices, and that indeed in Popper's view we can't get away from these. But clearly, and this is something that's distinctive to his perspective, he says, while we interpret the world in these kinds of ways, our interpretations may not be correct. And so it's then very important for us to try to get criticism of these ideas. And indeed, Popper has said here that what is really important and what's distinctive of human beings is that we have at least the possibility to allow our hypotheses to die in our stead. Let me offer an illustration of this. There was a scientific study, which Popper sometimes referred to, about a frog. And this depicted a certain frog, a certain species of frog, as having sort of built into its perceptual apparatus in effect the hypothesis that food are sort of fly-sized objects that move around a bit. And so in the presence of these things, it would presumably stick its tongue out and spear the flies and eat them. But clearly this hypothesis might prove to be incorrect. You could imagine this frog sitting there surrounded by flies, which had, in a sense, anticipated what was going on, and which remained perfectly still. And if the flies could stand it for long enough, you could imagine the frog eventually starving to death, surrounded by what were actually edible things, but ones which, by the theories that it had built into it, as it were classified as not consisting of food. Now, this was a case where frogs, certainly these frogs, weren't in a position to take a kind of critical distance to their built-in ways of understanding things and to criticize and say, well, perhaps, although we see things like this, I wonder if things are actually like that. And what Popper said is, look, the really important thing for us as human beings is to expose our ideas to criticism, to expose what comes naturally to us to criticism, so that we can discard bad ideas rather than dying with them, like the frog might in this particular case. Popper again stresses that individual doubt or individual certainty isn't necessarily a good guide to truth. He stresses again intersubjective appraisal rather than saying that one is going to be an expert, as it were, as to whether one's own ideas are okay or not okay. What is really important for Popper is to learn from intersubjective criticism, to learn from people who perhaps haven't said anything up to this point as to whether or not the ideas are any good. We can, though, and this again is something that Popper stresses, undertake such criticism only in a piecemeal manner. At any one point we can submit an element of our knowledge for criticism, but we can only do this while taking for granted, relatively uncritically at that point, various other things. We can at any one point say, no, I'm starting to be suspicious of this, something which we've taken for granted up to this point, but then we have to take other things uncritically for granted when we're doing it. This means that there's no one single element of our knowledge which can't be submitted to criticism, but we can't do everything at once. We have to do it at any one point against a background of things which we're tentatively assuming to be unproblematic at that time. Popper sees us as being shaped by the products of human action, by theories and culture and so on. These are things which in some of his later writings he refers to as World 3, in contradistinction to the physical World 1, to the sort of world of desks and tables and so on, and the subjective World 2, the world of our psychological understanding and so on. And Popper sees our own selves as being influenced by culture, influenced by ideas, formed by these things, and indeed he sees these three worlds, as it were, the physical world, the psychological world, and this world of cultural objects and abstract objects as interacting by way of human action. What about society? Popper is here best known for a work called The Open Society and Its Enemies, which was written during World War II. The main ingredients of this were, first of all, Popper's ideas about knowledge, which I've already been talking about. Second, he was critical of elitism and of ideas about historical inevitability. These latter ideas he criticized by way of a critical engagement with Plato on the one side and Marx on the other side. So The Open Society and Its Enemies is an exposition of Popper's ideas, but much of the criticism is undertaken by way of criticism of Plato on the one side and Marx on the other. His own social philosophy draws on some themes from Kant and the Kantian tradition, and also some themes from utilitarianism. In practical terms here, Popper wishes the state to be the protector of the individual by way of securing his or her liberty, and also, and this is quite distinctive in Popper, their freedom from economic exploitation. So Popper stresses liberty, Popper stresses freedom, but within this he wants to say people should be protected from economic exploitation, and there's a point of difference between Popper on the one side and some of the people on the right on the other who would agree with Popper with regard to other elements of liberty, but might ask questions about this notion of protecting people from economic exploitation. At the same time, in Popper's view, the concern of public policy should be the relief of human suffering. The pursuit, by contrast to this, of issues of well-being should be up to individuals themselves. I mean, basically what Popper says is it should be the proper concern of government to try to address issues where there's flagrant injustice or where people are suffering. If you say, well, what about the finer things of life? What about opera, for example? Popper says, look, that is something where basically if you think opera is wonderful and you think it really has to be shared with a friend, then it's up to you to go and do it. Not least because at the end of the day, it's open to your friend to say, look, I'm only going to be your friend if you promise never to play Wagner to me anymore, okay? So what he's saying on this is that there's diversity with regard to these things, that at a certain level you can leave up to individual enterprise the issue of this, particularly because you can tell other individuals to go away in a way in which you can't tell the state to go away if it is trying to look after your positive well-being rather than just trying to overcome suffering and injustice. One reason for this is he thought that you can just get a larger degree of agreement about whether someone is suffering than you're likely to be as to what would make them most happy. Such governmental actions, he wants to stress, when its government is addressing issues of human suffering, are likely, though, to have unintended consequences. When the government does things like when we do things, all kinds of things are likely to go wrong. There are likely to be unintended consequences. And what Popper then stressed was the need that this means for politicians and civil service to get critical feedback from citizens, because citizens will be the people who discover where things are going wrong. Although what gets perhaps a bit tricky is that politicians and public servants won't necessarily like to hear that their plans and their ideas haven't really worked out too well. Indeed, for Popper, each individual is valuable as a source of criticism and of feedback. He stressed this as an interpretation of democracy, the way in which one could see democracy as involving this possibility of feedback. He says that at a certain level, this is echoing a theme in Kant, that there's a notion of the rational unity of mankind. People share in terms of their reason, but where Popper stresses very much, reason is to be interpreted in terms of the offering of criticism. And he says that this is a capacity that everyone has got. What is one to make of this? Was it a big deal? Well, Popper's criticisms of Plato and of Marx led to quite a lot of ructions. As you can well imagine, the people who were keen on Plato said, well, I don't think Popper is really sound on Plato, but what he said about Marx is really very good. The Marxists said, he's really got Plato there, you know, he's making, but his stuff on Marx really isn't reliable. This, I think, means that what he's offered is controversial, it's interesting. There's still arguments going on about it, and I'm not sure that all the criticisms of Marx have yet been fully worked through by people who still uphold Marxism. What about his positive ideas? Well, on the one side, I think these are very reasonable sounding. I mean, when they're set out, it's sort of difficult to fault them. But they have, I think, striking implications if they're taken seriously. I mean, imagine, for example, taking seriously the issue of evaluating public policy. Whenever, say, a politician or a public servant proposes something, you might ask, okay, how are we going to evaluate whether or not this works? If someone is keen on teaching reform or whatever, we say, okay, yeah, it's a fine idea, but what about building into how things are done an assessment of whether or not, on the one side, this actually does the job, and secondly, of what the bad unintended consequences are. And those people who've taken seriously some of Popper's ideas in this area have become just very aware of the very limited extent to which this really does happen. There are, I think, some reasons why this doesn't happen terribly well. And there's a sense in which, I think, the incentives in some ways are wrong. That's to say, it's very difficult for a politician to stand up and say, yes, I came to you commending this particular policy, you gave me your confidence, we put it into operation, and I now have to tell you that it's completely worthless. I mean, the danger is that if a politician stood up and did this, his opponents wouldn't let him forget it, and he would never enjoy public office again in a similar kind of way. Public servants are likely to be very reluctant to admit that things have gone horribly wrong, and where they have, people just expect people to lose their jobs for it. And I think that this highlights a kind of difficulty about Popper's approach, which is that he paints a nice picture about what politics should be doing, but there's a question about how could it do this. And indeed, my own feeling is that things here may be a bit easier in the private sector and that Popper's ideas about criticism and feedback can be applied there a little bit more easily. I mean, for example, one's read quite often about entrepreneurs who indeed are the people, often people who made a lot of money, who may say, yes, I made several mistakes, and I was able to interpret market signals that I'd got it wrong, I reacted to this quickly, and I moved on to something else. And people don't turn to these people and say, he's no good, he made a mistake. I mean, typically in the culture, one recognizes that people have made mistakes and have learned from them in a way in which in political culture is much more difficult. At the same time, I think, one shouldn't get too carried away by this, because I think while one might see private enterprise as something within which the learning aspect of Popper's work can be put into operation a bit more easily than in politics, there's a sense in which one also needs, particularly on big issues, a public sphere of intersubjective criticism and discussion about how things are working out. And if one thinks in practical terms, this is normally something that takes place around government. I mean, it seems to me no surprise that it's in Washington, D.C., that one has public policy institutes, one has debates, one has people testifying and so on, and in which all kinds of big issues about society, about how tendencies are going, about where there are problems and how they might be addressed are being discussed, such that if one thought of government, almost as being replaced by purely private activity, this sphere for wider public policy debate might itself disappear. So it seems to me that one can be torn a little bit on this, that Popper's ideas are attractive, but how to put them into operation becomes a bit tricky. What about wider implications? Well, it seems to me personally that Popper's work suggests some significant ideas for the contemporary fad, I suppose you could call it, of knowledge management. There's been a lot of concern in this area for the putting into operation of information technology in companies. People haven't got the sort of return from it that they were hoping. They then think what we have to do is to consider how we handle knowledge within companies, how we, in a sense, come to understand the kind of knowledge that we've got scattered through our companies. Often when people are looking at this, they treat this knowledge as being just a scatter of information across their companies. I think what Popper can lead us to learn here is to think of what is going on in companies as often consisting of theories, perhaps which the director of the companies has, the boss has, various other people have got, which other people in the company, if they got the opportunity, might be in a position to significantly correct. And to think of knowledge in a commercial setting, knowledge within companies and enterprises, as consisting of theories which are fallible rather than just knowledge which is spread around. In conclusion, I'd say this. Popper, I think, has striking ideas about science and about human knowledge. These lead to what seems to me to be an interesting and provocative view of the human situation. This interrelates with challenging ideas about how we should approach social issues, although these point, as I've suggested, in slightly different directions. And this, in turn, I think, may lead to a rethinking of our ideas about political organization and how we see and organize knowledge in the private sector, too, and thus to developments in management. Accordingly, it seems to me there is a very wide sweep to Popper's work, and I'm very conscious in talking over this period that I've said only a little about the many ideas and the many challenging ideas that are to be found there. So, if I could just remind you what we have done, after a few preliminaries and a placing of Popper, we talked about his view of scientific knowledge by way of a challenge to traditional ideas about the authority of science and how learning took place, to traditional ideas about the authority of science and of people with knowledge. We then explored the view of scientific knowledge which results from Popper, learning by way of conjectures and refutations, not induction, the importance of intersubjective criticism, the social ideas about the character of objectivity. We then turned to the big picture, to Popper's picture of us as having biological predispositions, of ourselves as being influenced by culture, and again, the significance of learning and intersubjective criticism. We took this message, the emphasis on intersubjectivity and criticism, into the area of politics. And in this context explored how these offered an interpretation of democracy and posed some interesting problems about politics and political organization, but where at the end I suggested these could be cashed out in various different ways, as hopes for what might happen within politics itself, about ideas that might be set out and used as an interpretation of what could be done privately, but then as this leading to the continuing problem about the public sphere and the general area within which criticism could take place. And indeed, this notion of criticism, I think, is the key to Popper's work, because he sees us, above all, as being people who are rational in the sense of being able to offer criticism, but also, if we put our minds to it and think properly about our institutions, to learn from the criticism of others. Thank you very much.